So anyway, this is where we opened in 1980 on Gilman Way, and designed the brewery to brew 10 barrel batches, 300 gallons per batch, maximum capacity. The first year with the equipment we had to do about 1,500 barrels. We did about half that our first year in 1980. And so we did our first batch of beer November 15th. It was 5 barrels of stout, 150 gallons of stout. And that was sort of to break the equipment in. We were planning on launching with a pale ale, so our anniversary a few weeks ago was from the 15th, our first beer. Pale ale number 1 was brewed a few days later, and we started to try to figure out how to make beer consistent batch after batch, and we struggled. Our first 10 batches we didn't sell, we dumped them. There was nothing really wrong with them, but they were different, so every batch was a little different than the last one, and we realized that we really weren't going to be able to go to market until we could figure out how to make the same beer batch after batch. So here I am in the mash tun. Back in those days, I did all the brewing. I did all the bottling. My partner did the fermentation side and the bookkeeping. It was just 2 of us when we first started. This was my mash tun. Again, I said I bought a lot of dairy equipment, and we were very also lucky to have Duke College, community college here that taught welding and fabrication and all those skills that I thought I needed to know to build my own equipment. And I brought it all out to the campus. I had all my tanks out there, and I was able to use their welders and their drill presses and other equipment, which we didn't own. And I like to show this shot because the bottom, this is my mash tun, the bottom is stainless steel plates I bought somewhere. I couldn't afford to buy perforated plating. At that point, again, I was out of money. And so I spent many days doing about 4,000 holes through the bottom of this stainless steel bottom.
Wow.
Probably would have been cheaper to buy perforated. So this is what my brew kettle looked like. It was some old tank I picked up somewhere. Equipment was really not very pretty and really didn't look like a traditional brewery. But $500, I had a brew kettle and a bit of labor. It's still making beer today. I sold this equipment to a small brewery when we moved over here, and as far as I know, they're still using it day in and day out to brew over at Mad River. This was my daughter Sierra, and this was my truck. I like to show both of them. This is my '57 Chevy, and this was our first brewery truck that was used to pick the malt up. There was a malt house at the time in San Francisco called Bauer Schweitzer Malting, and they were providing malt back in the early days in the 40s and 50s to a very vibrant brewing industry in San Francisco. Lucky Lager was there and Falstaff was there. This piece of artwork I have out front, that's aluminum burnished etching out there, was out of the tasting room at the Burgermeister Brewery in San Francisco. So San Francisco had a long history of breweries. But it was down to just Anchor. It was the only one left in San Francisco buying malt from this little malt house, and I was buying malt, and we were like about the only 2 customers. And so the property was so valuable, it was not too far from Fisherman's Wharf that the malt house closed back in the early 80s. But I used to drive this old truck down to San Francisco, and I had a couple of old rice bins on the back, those red square rice bins. My very first trip down there, I had no idea how much malt weighed or anything like that, so I went to the malt house the first time with this old truck, and these 2 bins on the back. And the chute was used for filling rail cars, so the thing's like this big in diameter. And the guy pulls the lever, and the thing just fills up, and the truck does that. He fills both hoppers up, and I drive over to the scale so they could charge me. And I had 10,200 pounds on my 1-ton truck. a little much. And, so I'm just freaked out. I said, you got to take half of it back at least, and there's no way I can drive with this. And then, no, you bought it, it's yours. Well, you cannot take it all back at this point, it's yours. So I drive out of this malt house, and the front end is just bouncing barely on the road, seriously, and I can only go about 45. So I'm driving all the way back from San Francisco, and I get pulled over by a highway patrolman by Yuba City or somewhere. He didn't ticket me, he didn't have a scale, but he knew something was up. And so I had an awful big load on it. Oh no, it's fine, it's fine. So after that, it was 1 bin, and 1 bin was about the maximum that the truck could handle. But I also used the same truck to deliver my first load of beer outside of Chico, and I took 1 pallet of beer down to our first distributor when we decided we needed to sell a little more beer and wanted to expand out of Chico. And I drove down to South San Francisco to E&D Distributing, and I had this one, look at the truck. I mean, there's not a good shot of it, but it was not a pretty truck. And the bed I had made out of scrap 2x4s, they were only about 2 feet long. That's why all these uprights were there. So I go down there, and I've got one pallet of beer, and this guy, I drive in, and here's, a shiny Budweiser truck, and I drive this in with one pallet of beer, and everybody was just laughing at me, and I'm just like, what's going on, But I didn't realize that not everybody delivered beer like that. But this is what we started with as far as the fermentation cellar. We had 2 open fermenters, dairy tanks that I picked up, and a Bodlo cooler, and those of you may have seen this copper cooler in the hallway out here. We started out with a stainless steel version of that, and the wort would trickle over the outside, and chilled water would flow through the pipes inside. And that's how we would cool our wort and get it ready for fermentation. So after the boiling process, the temperature of the wort's about 212 degrees, 214 degrees, a little above water. And it would trickle over the outside, we'd pump chilled water, cool it down, pump it into the fermenter, throw the yeast in, and start the fermentation process. So very basic brewing. I mentioned we were sort of copying the English tradition. And I saw pictures of these coolers in some of these old English books, so I saw one in a scrapyard somewhere, and that's what I want to get. So that's what we started out with. And here was our first fermentation. We were pretty excited. And we had a promising first year, so we were doing, at this point, 25 barrels a week. I'm not sure when this article was written, but probably not too much after we got started. And we expect to double over the next 2 to 4 months. So 25 barrels a week. Our big brew house here is 200 barrels, so we brew 12 to 13 times a day currently. So very, very small amount of beer we were producing back then. This is a snapshot of what all of the small breweries in America was in 1981. And almost all of these, the top 6 are the upstart breweries, and the rest of them are old family breweries that survived Prohibition, opened back up after Prohibition, and were eking out a living. These numbers, I notice on the right, their volumes are actually not what they were making. That's what they could have made. And back in those days, nobody wanted to admit what they were actually making, so they put their theoretical plant capacity, because every year all these breweries were declining pretty rapidly, and they didn't want to show their competitor that, geez, they're only making 30,000 barrels out of their million-barrel brewery. So these numbers stayed the same year after year until these breweries went out of business. They would never divulge sort of where they were at in their demise. But unfortunately, half of these breweries, or more than half of these breweries now, are no longer in existence. A few of the brands have been bought up by large breweries in this country. But most of them have just sort of struggled and succumbed to the pressures of being an old, small American brewery trying to compete making lager beer against the major brewers. And most of these breweries, without exception, were making the same kind of beer. They were trying to compete head-to-head with what the big guys were doing. You can't do that as a producer making 30,000 barrels or 50,000 barrels. The economies of scale just aren't there, and these breweries didn't have enough cash flow to invest in new equipment and quality control procedures. So unfortunately, most of them struggled and have since gone out of business. There's been a couple exceptions. Probably the biggest one on here is Yuengling, which here is showing at 200,000 barrels, and they may have not even been that back in 1981. Today they're over 2 million barrels, so they're really one of the only big success stories back from these days. I see Michael. Are you ready, Michael? I've got like an hour and a half left of slides, so if I don't keep going, we'll have a really late night, or I'll skip some of it. So.